Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what I hope will be the first of many little impromptu podcasts that are going to be about anything and everything. Basically anything I feel like jabbering on about. For as long as you feel like listening to me. I may at certain points bring on guests, I may bring on people to play off of, but for this inaugural little take, I thought I'd just sit down and talk about, well, anything really. Anything and anything that comes to mind. But this was really prompted by a friend of mine, a fellow author by the name of Kit Power, who I've been doing a fair few podcasts and recordings with, including a commentary on RoboCop, 1980s RoboCop, and the sequel to Hellraiser, Hellbound, which was lots of fun. And we also recently finished recording a podcast concerning It, Stephen King's It, and its various different adaptations, which was a lot of fun. And that inspired me to really go back and have a look at not only It, the book, but also King's entire back catalogue. Now, Stephen King's an interesting one for me. Unlike Clive Barker, whose work I generally absolutely adore in almost all of its forms. There's very, very few Barker books, certainly from his heyday, sort of between the 1980s and right up to the mid to late 1990s, that I haven't read multiple times. King is hit and miss. They emphasize, despite being generally thrown together, lumped together as horror writers. I mean, that's a ridiculous distinction in and of itself. It exists exclusively for the purposes of marketing. I mean, at what point does the Great and Secret show stop being horror and become science fiction? At what point does something like Misery stop being horror and become a psychological treatise, you know? Generally speaking, these distinctions, these categories do not help us. They do not help us as writers, they do not help us as readers. They have this hideous tendency to infantilize our reading by categorizing it and making us go for what we feel is going to be familiar and known, the known quantity, which is death for horror. Basically, if you look at pretty much any writer that's been writing for any extended period of time, and certainly someone whose back catalogue is as enormous as Stephen King's, then you're going to find work that strays into fantasy, into science fiction. There are little sort of domestic dramas. There are all sorts of different styles and forms of writing in the man's back catalogue. And to sort of categorize him as horror doesn't really do him a great service, I feel. Although that is certainly the genre that he's most positively identified with, because he effectively resurrected it single-handedly. Before King's books started to sell like gangbusters in the 1980s, horror was really is one of its doldrums, which does tend to happen with the genre. I'm sad to say. It has these great peaks and troughs where you'll get a particular work or a particular series of works that are seminal, that reinvigorate and reinvent it and make it profitable again. And then you'll get these periods of high invention that can last entire decades, and then it'll slump again. It'll become familiar, it'll become formulaic, and what you'll end up getting are sort of hideous parodies of work that's intended to horrify, of work that is intended to disturb and distress, and then it dies. It dies a death. Familiarity and formula are death for horror. Interestingly, we seem to... I'm sort of crossing my fingers here, I hope it's the case. We seem to be at the opening stages, the early years of one of its resurrections, of one of its renaissances. I sincerely hope that's the case, because it needs it. It really, really needs it. I mean, in 2016, we had two films at the cinema, late 2016, that emphasised two very different forms of horror. You had It, which the adaptation of Stephen King's It, which was huge, blockbuster, sort of popular horror. not an amazing horror film in and of itself. In terms of horror, it is not going to reinvent or reinvigorate horror in and of itself, but what it has done is open the door. It's opened the door because it was popular. It sold, it made a lot of money. So what you are going to be getting now are producers and studios looking at horror, and in particular, horror that was made in the 1980s. There is going to be a slew of Stephen King adaptations for both TV and cinema. They may even look further afield. Maybe we'll start getting some Clive Barker adaptations. Maybe we'll start getting some Ramsey Campbell adaptations. Who knows? Who knows? I sincerely hope so. But contrasted to that, we also had The Ritual by Adam Neville, which is an independent work made good. You know, it's clever, it's British, it's this clever, very, comparatively very small budget, very contained, psychological, potentially supernatural horror, but which is very ambiguous. It's one of those wonderful bits of independent horror that it strays beyond the bounds of the psychological and the actual. It transgresses beyond something that's entirely metaphorical or entirely actual and objective, and interbleeds those two concepts. So there comes a point where it's difficult to tell what's happening in the film, whether what you're seeing is literal or whether it's a psychological projection, very much in the vein of Neil Marshall's The Descent, very much in that style, and it's a wonderful piece of work. It's well worth checking out, as is the original novel, by the way, which is a very different beastie from the film. The film takes a dramatic departure at one point from the book. Well worth checking out. I would highly recommend that if you haven't seen it. But as a result of that, there is going to be a sort of King renaissance. There is certainly going to be multiple adaptations of Stephen King's works, including the sequel to it, which is going to be a very hard sell. It's going to be a very hard sell because it's the weaker part of the book when the children grow up, when we're dealing with the adult portion of the book. It's certainly the point at which it's going to be very difficult to make an effective film adaptation. It's the point at which the original 1990s adaptation, the TV adaptation, falls flat on its face. So we'll see. We'll see. I sincerely hope that the sequel, the adult version, is a dramatic departure from the first film. Not because I disliked the first film, I actually really liked the first film, but I think that's how it's going to be effective. If it actually, in the same way that the first film emphasizes childhood horror, if this one emphasizes very actual adult concerns and anxieties, I think that's the way to go. But anyway, yes, as a result of those experiences, I've been going back and looking at I can't do all of Stephen King's books, by the way, in the way that I am going to be doing all of Barker's books, because Barker's back catalogue is much more constrained than King's is. Barker doesn't write like King does, and never did. He was never as prolific as King was, and he seems to have gone away entirely now, which is really sad. I would dearly love to believe that there is going to be a sequel to Galilee. I would dearly love to believe that there is going to be the last few books of the art. I just don't think it's going to happen, sadly, and that makes me very sad. But it's prompted me to go back and look at the Stephen King books that I've read and that have made an impact on me. Now, interestingly, one of the very first works of straight horror that I ever read, of adult horror, certainly as a kid, and I was very young, was The Mist, which is not a book in and of itself. It's actually one of the short stories from, I believe it's from Skeleton Crew. I believe it was published in Skeleton Crew originally, which is a collection of very long short stories and novellas. And I read it as I read a lot of this stuff originally because I was a kid, I was on holiday with my parents, and one of the things my mother and I used to do is, when we went on holiday, we would go and take out a selection of books from the local library, and we would take them with us when we went on holiday, so we would have some reading material, and inevitably, I would just devour everything that I'd taken with me, and then I'd have to borrow my mum's books. And I was very fortunate in that regard. I was very fortunate because my mum would let me read whatever I liked. I was very unconstrained and unrestricted in what I could read and watch as a child. And I remember talking to her about The Mist, and she was very enthusiastic about it. She would tell me, like, what was happening in the story she was reading, and I would tell her, and then we'd swap the books over. So I read The Mist, and I can't have been very old. I must have been 7 or 8 when I read The Mist. And to say it was revelatory is something of an understatement. I mean, I was already well versed in certain forms of horror by that point. Cinematic horror, certainly. I mean, I'd already watched my mum's VHS library of horror films and loved horror films and loved horrific material in general. But it was the very first straight horror story I'd ever read. I'd dabbled in other forms of horrific and disturbing material. Like I was already well versed in things like the Greek myths and the Celtic myths, and Roman stories and ancient Egyptian mythology and all that stuff, folklore tales, fairy stories, all that stuff, which certainly has horrific elements and which provides contexts for modern and postmodern horror stories, because of course many of the same anxieties and cultural concerns are explored through them. But The Mist is important to me in a number of ways. Now, as I say, King is kind of hit and miss for me. There are books I absolutely love, and there are books that really I can't be dealing with, that just don't do it for me. They just do not do it for me. I think the big distinction between Barker and King, and I'm one of those lovers of horror who will always go for Barker over King, or Barker's style of fiction, because it's more deviant, it is more surreal, it's more transgressive than King's tends to be. And that's not a condemnation of King's works, that is actually a very legitimate form of horror. What I find, certainly with King's canonized works, if you like, the ones that people regard as emblematic of King's horror, certainly the ones from the 1980s, like It, like The Stand, like The Shining, all of that stuff, is that they're very traditional in many respects. They sort of reinforce certain cultural narratives about what is evil and what is good. Generally speaking, the innocents survive, and the demons or the ghosts or the monsters are done away with, or they die. And that's the way King's horror works. That's its appeal. Whereas Barker's is way more transgressive. It's all about actually bringing into question those meta-narratives. It's about blowing them apart. It's about showing you what is attractive about the monster. The monsters and the demons and the ghosts in Barker's fiction are as likely to fuck you and for you to absolutely love it as they are to devour you or skin you alive, or they may do both at the same time or one after the other, who knows. And that's what I like. That's something that appeals to me. It's why I like the work of Poppy Z. Bright, aka Billy Martin. It's why I like all of that wonderful transgressive stuff. It's why I like the commingling of the erotic and the horrific. I really that's a tension I absolutely adore. Whereas King is more traditional, generally speaking. There are monsters, there are evil people, there are good people. You see it very much in The Stand. You see it emphasized in The Stand, where you have that dynamic crystallized as an actual metaphysics. But it doesn't really appeal to me. Always. It doesn't really speak to me or my tastes as such. And it's not universally the case. I mean, it's a many and varied thing, because at the same time that it reinforces certain meta-narratives, King's work also calls some of them into question. Like, for example, you have throughout King this criticism of small-town America. You have this undermining of the white picket fences in the same way that Alfred Hitchcock used to do it. You have this look behind the curtains, this undermining of the American dream, of America's perception of itself. And it's intermingled with a reinforcement of certain wider moral and spiritual narratives, which I find really interesting. I find that absolutely fascinating. The Mist is an odd one. The Mist is really weird. Certainly amongst King's earlier works, because, for one thing, it's nihilistic. It's a totally nihilistic story in the vein of H.P. Lovecraft, and it is a very Lovecraftian story. It's arguably one of King's most Lovecraftian stories. It has everything that you'd expect from Lovecraft. It has this phenomena that descends and has no explanation. It is sort of like a cosmic or existential phenomena that rips open the world and undermines everything we presume about reality. And through that phenomena come entities, come creatures that have no analogue in terrestrial biology or zoology, and whose intentions we just cannot wot of, we cannot even begin to preconceive, and they tend to consist largely of tentacles and spines and hideous unknowable anatomy, in the same way that Lovecraft stuff does. There are very Lovecraftian entities in the Mist, and it's Lovecraftian in terms of its nihilism as well. What the Mist really emphasizes is this notion of humanity being a speck, of humanity's history and civilizations being wiped out by this phenomena in the space of a day, in the space of nothing. Everything is wiped out, everything is destroyed by these creatures, and a new situation, a new status quo is established in which our world is transformed. That's certainly the suggestion at the end of the short story. Our world becomes something else. It becomes a new ecosystem for these creatures. And humanity, what's left of humanity, is just left to slowly die. It can't survive here because everything is hostile. Everything is hideously hostile in this new world. But it's also a story about how humanity doesn't really deserve to sustain. It doesn't really deserve to continue. It's the author of its own destruction. And it really is an exploration of our own inner monstrosity, which I really, really love. As a kid, I didn't really understand this stuff on a conscious level. I didn't understand it, but I somehow absorbed it. I somehow took it on, because it really did chill me. The Mist really left me feeling cold and strange and kind of isolated and alone in my own skull, and I loved it. I loved that. I found it's one of those stories that taught me I actually really love this sensation. I really love it. So after that, then I devoured everything on my mum's shelves. You know, everything from James Herbert to Dean Koontz to Stephen King to Ramsey Campbell to Clive Barker. All that stuff just went gaga for it. John Saul, who I don't even think is around anymore, Graham Masterton, all that stuff just went absolutely gaga for it and devoured the lot, even the shit stuff. And I will include the vast majority of Dean Koontz in that, by the way. I mean, nothing against you if you like Dean Koontz, if you respond to his work. It just does nothing for me. It actually irritates me quite a lot, because I find that Dean Koontz starts with very good ideas, very interesting and intriguing setups, then loses interest. Just loses interest, and the endings to his stories are terrible. Although that is often a criticism you can aim at King as well. But The Mist I love. I think it's a beautifully crafted story. And I've reread it a number of times since that initial reading to sort of reinforce for me its significance, its themes and its concepts. And every single reading, it swells. I notice more going on underneath the surface. I notice more complexities at work within the story, and I really, really love it. I love it on an aesthetic level. I think the monsters are very well drawn and very well introduced. You very rarely see them in their entirety because they are shrouded in this mist. You only see suggestions of their anatomy, and I love that. I absolutely love that, because you paint it. You paint what they are in your mind, and that makes them way more scary. That makes them way more disturbing. The way people die in this book is hideous. It's really powerfully hideous and very distinctly drawn. I also love the fact no one in this story is innocent. No one is innocent, barring the children characters, obviously. And even they are not safe. Even they are not safe in this story. It is highly unusual for a work of Stephen King's. It's highly unusual. Because he doesn't tend to write nihilism. Certainly not the sort of Lovecraftian nihilism where there is no hope in the universe, there is nothing, and where innocence cannot save you. That's very, very rare. The only other one I can think of that is like that is Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary certainly has that quality to it. Really, truly horrible, hideous book. Well worth reading because of that, because it is horrible and hideous, and is just monstrous. It's just hideous darkness and despair from page 1 onwards. Well worth a read as a result. But The Mist, it's beautiful, and I had a sort of resurgence of interest in it when the Frank Darabont film came out. I was kind of dreading it because it is one of Stephen King's stories that could be so easy to fuck up. So easy to fuck up and make risible. You know what? Frank Darabont was the perfect director for this material because he gets King. Frank Darabont is one of those guys. He's a Stephen King fan. He actually knows Stephen King. And he gets the material. He understands it. He's not just a super fan. He gets what has to be done to make it work. And he does. I mean, he directed the Shawshank Redemption, obviously, which is often is regarded as many people's best cinematic adaptation or best film of all time. It's a lot of people's favourite film. Not mine. I really enjoy it, but it's not my favourite film. But this is the thing with Darabont. He gets it. He gets King. And his adaptation of The Mist was like a spring rain in the midst of sweltering summers. It was like a trickle of water in parched desert and wasteland, because it came out of nowhere and nobody was making this kind of horror in cinema at the time it came out. Nobody was doing it. Horror was gone. Horror was dead at that point. And it's a beautiful film. It's really well put together. It captures the ethos of the book beautifully, and the themes, but adapts it just enough. But more importantly, it gets the monsters right. The monsters are what could have potentially killed it, because they could have come off as risible. They're not. They're actually very beautifully portrayed and framed. They have these wonderful set pieces involving them, and it works. The thing that the film changes dramatically is the ending. Oh, I say dramatically, it's not that dramatic. The film really does, it doesn't really change the ending, it extends it. So the ending of the book has the key characters driving into the mist, knowing that they've got nowhere to go, and that eventually they'll run out of gas, they'll run out of space, they'll hit a point where they have nothing, and they're going to die. They're either going to starve, or some of the creatures are going to get them, or some poison, some extra dimensional poison will get them, or something like that. And that's how it leaves it. It leaves it with them just trundling off into the mist. The book extends that. The film extends that so that it shows you them travelling through this alien world and seeing these vast alien creatures trundling through it. And they come to a point where, well, they have no choice. I'll leave it at that. They have no choice. The ending does something wonderful. It's aggressive towards its audience. Too few of horror films are aggressive and sadistic towards their audience. It's a wonderful thing for a work of horror to do, to induce feelings in their audience as though they've been violated, as though they've been assaulted, as though they feel depressed or despairing or violated. That's a great thing for a work of horror to do, and too few do it. This one does it. It actually feels violent. It actually feels as though it's punched you and then kicked you in the face while you're on the dirt for good measure. It's a very, very cool thing. And your enjoyment of the film will depend upon your ability to appreciate that. Now, I love it. I want horror. I want cinema, actually, in general, to make me feel something. Beyond just, oh, wow, that was a great special effect. No, I don't want to be able to get up and walk away from this stuff and then forget about it the next day. I want it to stay with me and to haunt me a little bit. I want it to have shifted my perceptions a little and unsettled me. The Mist does that. It really does punch you. It really hurts. It is like a physical blow, the end of that film, and it is wonderful. More of that, please, from the creators of horror. More of that. Be aggressive towards your audience. You know what? We kind of like it. The mainstream audiences won't. People who watch horror films casually will not like that. They're not used to it. But we do. Your core audience, the ones who will really appreciate this stuff, we like it. We have this masochistic edge to us, even when we don't acknowledge it. That's why we read this stuff. That's why we consume it. Of course we have this masochistic edge. We like you to manipulate us. We like you to make us feel things, negative things, because that's what it's for. That's what it's for. It's what horror is for, you know? And Darabont's adaptation of The Mist does it beautifully. Another thing about the short story, The Mist was my introduction to Lovecraft. I didn't know it at the time because I'd heard the term Lovecraftian, I think, but I didn't know who Lovecraft was. I don't think I'd read any of his stories at that point. But that was my introduction to the themes and to the consistent images and tropes and concepts within a Lovecraftian horror story. It wouldn't be for many years until I picked up an actual Lovecraft story. I don't think I actually read an actual Lovecraft story until very late on, until I was 21. So much later. But by that point, I'd already read things like The Mist. I'd read Neil Gaiman's parodies, Shoggoth's Old Peculiar, and a couple of his other ones. There were a couple of parody Lovecraft stories that Gaiman has written that are very funny, very, very good. Shoggoth's Old Peculiar is actually stunning. It's really funny. It's two Lovecraftian horror creatures having a go at H.P. Lovecraft for getting it wrong. They're like at a bar in Innsmouth, and they're having a go at him for getting things wrong. It's hilarious. I read Brian Lumley's stuff. You know, the stuff that's derived from Lovecraft and that expands on the mythology. And then I came to Lovecraft later, but I didn't realise until I started reading Lovecraft that The Mist was a Lovecraftian story. I didn't really get it at that time, but it put it into context for me. It really put it into context. And as a result, my reading is now expanded. My reading is expanded enormously. And it's quite a wonderful experience to go back to it and to read it with all of these new contexts and the old. It kind of programmed me for this stuff in many respects. It planted the taste for it, which is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I came to King before I came to Barker. I didn't actually know until I was 11 that Barker wrote stories, that Barker wrote books. He was just the Hellraiser guy. Up until that point. So it's actually a wonderful thing to be able to compare and contrast the two types of horror that Barker and King emphasize, and even the points at which they intersect. I mean, there are obviously areas where they intersect and cross over, where they explore similar concepts and themes and notions, obviously in very different ways. But it's interesting. It's absolutely fascinating to me. But yes, that was The Mist, which I would highly recommend. I really enjoy it. It's a beautiful, well-sculpted, well-crafted Lovecraftian horror story. And well worth your time, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you enjoyed this, please let me know. I will do more. I will do them regularly because I kind of enjoy sitting down and jabbering on about nothing very much. I may do more about King's stories that had an effect upon me. I may do just stories and books in general. That would be kind of fun. So please let me know. Please let me know. And I will speak to you again very soon, hopefully. Ta-ta!